And the record button is smashed. Welcome to Podcast Titles Are a Spook. I'm your host, James Weeks. Today I am joined by Vice Presidential candidate Spike Cohen. Spike, why don't you tell the people about yourself for those who may not know who you are?
Hey, everybody. My name is Spike Cohen, as James just said. I am a former small business owner who started a web design company in my teens, and I am the owner of, or co-owner of Muddy Waters Media, the host of My Fellow Americans, and the co-host of the Muddy Waters of Freedom. And back in December, I started my run as Vermin Supreme's running mate for the presidential and vice presidential nomination for the Libertarian Party. And I have been having a tremendous amount of fun in the last 5 months.
All right. So, with what's the goal with running? With Vermin Supreme here. Obviously, for those who've listened to the podcast before, but for those who may be tuning in, let's not bury the lead. What's the primary objective of going for the Libertarian Party nomination? When, of course, right, so libertarians don't win elections. But what would be the reasoning? Why should they when it comes to November? Vote for Vermin and Spike?
Well, I think the reason I got into this race is probably the best way to answer this, because, initially, if you had asked me a year ago how involved I would have been in electoral politics, I would have said that unless, libertarians decided to nominate someone who was just, a total subversive, that I really would have no interest in electoral politics. I tend to lean more towards agorism and counter economics and illegalism over electoral politics as an effective way to actually affect any kind of real change. Using the old George Carlin line that if elections worked, that they wouldn't let you do it. So when Vermin got into the race, and I had him on my show last October, we had a really great conversation about what he was trying to accomplish. And I had been following Vermin somewhat closely since I think 2008 or 2012. And was fascinated by him and how much attention he could get by just showing up and basically trolling the New Hampshire primaries once every 4 years, and seeing how he had turned that into an actual legit run for the Libertarian Party nomination, and was getting an increasing amount of support, not just from people who are more on the left side of the libertarian spectrum, but also on just people across the board who were fed up with this, constant pattern of us picking so-called respectable candidates to show up and be completely ignored or made fun of by, corporate media and the people that are in charge. I was really fascinated by what he was trying to do. And so in November, when they asked me to be his running mate, and I realized that it was a little bit of the whole reason I got into doing my shows and doing Muddy Waters Media was to try to spread the message of liberty outside of libertarian circles. Libertarians are good at talking to other libertarians largely. Even then, not so much. There's a lot of infighting even there. But libertarians have kind of nailed telling other libertarians how libertarian we are. You even see it, how it's reflected in our conventions. When we go to these state conventions, we all, we go past. You figure if you're traveling from one state to another to go to a state convention, you pass countless hundreds or even thousands, or if you went into a major airport, possibly tens of thousands of people in order to get into a small room or even a medium-sized conference room with dozens or maybe hundreds of other libertarians who already all agree with you. And then we get together and talk about how libertarian we are, and then we go back out and try not to make eye contact with anyone in the lobby. Vermin is doing the opposite. He's doing those things, or was doing those things back when we were allowed to leave our houses. He's meeting with libertarians and doing the work of delegate servicing and all of that stuff. But more importantly, he's actually reaching out to the general public. And he's not doing it by, starting a conversation about whether or not healthcare is a right, or, whether or not, the Fed needs to be ended or audited or whatever. He's going out just by being, for lack of a better word, a clown. He's going out and being a lovable, affable character that he's created, that is an opportunity for people to engage in just a little bit of a departure from the terrible news that we're constantly getting, and the horrible lies from politicians that we're constantly hearing, and they're being drawn to them. When I was in New Hampshire with Vermin, I was watching people in the middle of Bernie's victory speech jumping off of the off of the bleachers to come and have their selfies taken with us and get autographs by us and tweet and post online that they had just met us. What we're trying to do, and what my goal is with this campaign, is to use nonlinear messaging, satirical ideas and humor to reach out to people outside of our circles who don't give a damn about libertarianism. Or if they do, they probably have a bad take from it, either because someone gave them a bad take of libertarianism, or a libertarian who has no business talking about libertarianism to other people told them a really bad idea of what it was. So my goal is to use this kind of nonlinear messaging to reach out to essentially an entire generation of people and non-voters and everyone else who this system has completely left behind, and show them that there is a complete departure from what they've heard are the only real solutions to their problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there is a lot of that, a lot of bad messaging going on. I notice there's a lot of libertarians that they think that just screaming at people taxation is theft over and over and over again is how you run a libertarian campaign.
Right.
I mean, that lands when you're at a Libertarian Party convention.
Right.
But that doesn't land when you're at Walmart.
It doesn't. And the thing is, it's important for us to get out the message that taxation is theft and the purpose behind it. That's completely different from just saying taxation is theft and kind of doubling down on that when anyone says, because the average person, when you talk to them about taxation, even if they don't like taxation, even if they think it should be lower or that there shouldn't be as many taxes as there are, if you really press the average, normie and average non-libertarian out there, they're going to say, well, taxation is necessary and, provides services that we all use and need. And if we weren't, using taxation to extract that money, we wouldn't be able to get it otherwise in an efficient and effective way. So even though I don't like taxes and maybe I think they should be done differently, or the rich should have to pay a higher percentage of them or whatever, or we should just be paying less across the board or whatever it is, they're largely going to think it's okay. And if the only response you have to that is to either just keep saying taxation is theft, or now pivot to the much more effective line of calling them bootlickers and all of that, then ultimately you're not only are you losing people to your message, you're actually making them hostile to your message. And you're making it so that when someone else shows up and wants to give a more empathetic take and a more easy to process take on taxation, you've made it harder. You've already scorched the earth and made it harder for them to do that. If you're going to talk about politics with someone, and this is doing it seriously. Again, I have found, as has Vermin, it's often best to do it in this satirical way so that people are fascinated with what you're doing and then reach out to you and ask you what it is you actually believe. And we have that constantly. We're constantly getting emails and messages to both of us asking, okay, seriously, what is it that you really want? You're out here campaigning that you're going to give everyone cheesy bread, and you keep talking about a badger and then saying you're refusing to explain the badger. What is it you're actually doing? Because you can't. I mean, you seem like a not insane person. So what is it you want? But if you're talking to someone in a serious way, we need to have these conversations about taxes and occupational licensing and zoning and war and immigration and healthcare and every single subject. But the best way to do that is to hear what it is they have to say and what their concerns are. B, demonstrate to that person that you actually give a damn about them for at least a few minutes. And then C, apply what their concerns are to apply our solutions to what their concerns are, rather than coming at them immediately and saying, well, you know what the real problem is taxation or the Fed or, quantitative easing or fiat currency or whatever. It's not going to land with people. They don't care. And if anything, you're just going to seem like a really weird, obscure person that isn't offering anything that they even care about. They're going to go right back to Republicans and Democrats who know how to pander and message to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Republicans and Democrats are very good at pandering.
Yeah.
But libertarians are not.
Libertarians are good at pandering to each other. Everyone else not so much. And I'm speaking with a bit of a broad brush here. I mean, there's some incredible messengers in the libertarian movement and in the party. There's some great anarchists that have done a terrific job spreading the message. So I'm not speaking about everyone, but we have absolutely nailed going in front of each other and saying the stuff that needs to be said to basically liberty signal to each other that, we're actual libertarians. You can trust us. We aren't one of these statists. And I mean, at this point, I think we've nailed that. I think we can move on to phase 2 of actually spreading a true, unwatered down, unvarnished message that is presented in an empathetic and way that resonates with the people that you're talking to.
Right. So what is some of the ways that you're finding success with that? Have you found a lot of people coming in that wouldn't normally be with join the Libertarian Party or get active in a Libertarian Party campaign? Are you finding a lot of that coming into the Vermin Spike campaign?
Absolutely. I can give 3 examples of that. One is what I've already kind of been talking about a little bit, which is that right now, in my mind, the most low-hanging fruit, as it were, from an electoral standpoint, are disaffected Democrats and disaffected progressive-leaning voters who are witnessing yet again where they were told that, they were being given these great, what they were told were good progressive options that were going to, address and recognize the problems that they've been facing. The average person who is under 30 in this country has really never experienced anything close to prosperity. What they've experienced is promises and stories about how it used to be and the reality of how it's actually happening now, where anything that they try to do to get ahead just leads to more debt, more restrictions, and ultimately no real change in their situation. And that is an incredible, and they're being told that it's, the free market or capitalism or, the American way. They're being told that this is the bedrock of our society. And if that's the case, they want that destroyed. So when Bernie Sanders comes up and says, I'm a socialist, which he isn't, but if he comes up and says, I'm a socialist or I'm a social democrat or democratic socialist or whatever, and, I'm going to completely subvert this system and completely change things around so that, we're going to tax the people that have been victimizing you and give you the things that you need to be able to survive so that you're not, reliant on low wage labor to be able to make ends meet, and you're not reliant on debt to be able to pay a healthcare emergency if you have one, or if you have a chronic illness or something like that. Or when Andrew Yang comes out and says, AI is coming, artificial intelligence is coming, and it's going to be taking all of our jobs, and we need to have universal basic income for everyone. This is resonating with people who have been completely left behind. And now they're witnessing all of those people who promised them, that they were going to revolutionize society. Instead, they're saying, it turns out I lost. I guess you got to vote for Joe Biden instead. After they have spent the last 2 years correctly explaining every problem with Joe Biden and how he's not even really a departure from Trump in any real way, other than which party he's currently being representing. And so this is a group of people who could be reached if we try to reach them. And Vermin has been terrific at this. If you go on Twitter and type in Vermin Supreme and just search Vermin Supreme, tweets about Vermin Supreme, there is literally an endless stream of people saying, I'm voting for Vermin Supreme. I'm going to write in Vermin Supreme. I'm supporting Vermin Supreme. I don't even care about libertarianism, but I'm going to support Vermin Supreme. And this is essentially just a lot of it is that it's love for Vermin and his persona and the way that he's been out there sharing love with people. It's also just a giant, it's a giant fuck you. It's a giant no confidence vote in the system. So that's been one incredible way that we've been reaching out to that group. 2 things that I've been doing or was doing back before the pandemic and the lockdowns and everything was going to marginalized communities and college campuses and talking to the students and the residents at those places. And it was very interesting that I would go there, let them start the conversation, or I guess I'd start it by approaching them, but I would ask them kind of leading questions to get them to start talking to me. In the housing projects and the low-income communities that I went to, their biggest concerns were the police and the fact that they couldn't get ahead. That was easily their biggest concerns, and just general safety and things like that. But their biggest concerns were that if they tried to get ahead, the police were always there to stop them. That was by and far the biggest thing we heard. So it was a perfect opportunity for us to talk to them about occupational licensing and the war on drugs and disproportionate, policing against minorities and people of color and low income people and things like that. And what was interesting about that was that I thought that our message would be well received. I didn't realize that they would be completing my sentences as I finished them. Mm-hmm. And it was an incredible situation there where we would go and be saying things and they were, again, completing my sentences as I finished. We signed up a bunch of people for the Libertarian Party. And more important than that, because I mean, parties come and go. And the most important thing was that we encountered a bunch of basically agorists living on state-owned property in those housing projects. Every single one of them had a side hustle that they weren't paying taxes on. Every single one of them was engaging in looking out for their neighbors whenever the police would come around. We witnessed it at firsthand. These people were living in a prefigurative society that they were creating with almost no means of their own. And yet they didn't necessarily have a word for it. They didn't really know what it was that they were doing. They were just doing it as a means of survival and trying desperately to get ahead. Mm-hmm. And so we were able to really be effective in that. The third one was talking to the college campuses. I would start conversations with the students and ask them if what their concerns were. And without fail, their biggest concerns were student debt. And so I would start having conversations with them about whether they thought they would be better off if they were able to skip the schooling and just go straight to apprenticing in their line of work, even if it was for free, where they aren't getting paid, but not having to pay and going straight into apprenticing for whatever their line of work was. And the vast majority of them said, yeah, that would be way better than what I'm doing now. And I wouldn't be having to run up debt. So then I got to have a conversation with them about, again, occupational licensing and the laws and requirements in place that the state has arbitrarily created and, how that's harming them. Those were conversations about coercive central planning that I was able to have by listening to what they had to say and then talking to them about how the state and how coercive central planning was hurting them that I would not have been able to have if I had just been holding up a sign that said audit the Fed or end the Fed or even end the wars or any of that. Mm-hmm. By having a conversation with what they wanted to hear, I was able to reach them on their literally where they both literally and figuratively where they were.
Right. So how do you, when you have your competition for the nomination, going on, and for example, just to name a few examples, we have during the Pennsylvania debate for the Libertarian Party of Pennsylvania, mm-hmm. I went out to that convention and I was watching parts of the debate for that. And there was a question about COVID-19 that was asked, and what to be done. What would a libertarian do about a global pandemic like COVID-19? And there was a candidate, Jo Jorgensen. I'm calling her out. She had said her answer was that this was back before it got really big in the United States. But right. The answer is still very telling and very concerning that this is the kind of answers that libertarians would give. And it was that it's not a big deal because only poor people in third world countries with bad air quality are dying from it. So it's not really a big deal. And, oh my God. And so like when you have people that are giving answers like that aren't immediately booed off stage and, are remaining in the race, there's a lot of work to be done to really rehab the image of libertarians because, the minute anyone outside that room would hear that, they would be like, well, fuck these guys. You look at.
She actually said that no one cares about it because the poor people in third world countries are getting it?
No, not that nobody cares about it because that it wasn't a big deal because of that it wasn't a concern because of that. That it wasn't, that it wouldn't be like that for us because they're just poor people in third world countries with bad air quality. Which is it's ridiculous. I'll post a link to the debate in the show notes.
Yeah, I didn't catch that. I did not catch that.
Yeah, I almost fell out of my chair when she said that.
Yeah,
I had to actually go to people and be like, did I just hear that right? Did she seriously just say that? And they're like, yeah. And it was crazy.
I mean, listen, there have been times where I've been live and said things, and then as I'm saying them, thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just said that. I don't believe I've ever said anything quite like that, though. That is definitely That's quite a hot take.
Yeah.
I mean, there are many different people are brought to the libertarianism for different reasons. And it's everything from people who want to help others and see the state as an impediment to doing that, people who have been harmed by the state themselves or have seen it firsthand and have been harmed by the state, people who have done a tremendous amount of, research. So they've come here on like sort of a cerebral level. They've come here after, intellectually looking through all of their options. And there is, unfortunately, and I'm not going to accuse Joe of this or any individual person, but there is a contingent of people who are here because they see us as the ones who are going to tax them the least, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. But if that's your only concern in life, is that as little is taken from you personally as possible, or from your business or from whatever else, then that speaks to a bigger problem about what your motivations are. I say that as a former neocon who owned a business whose primary concern was that taxes be as low as possible. I didn't care what the military was doing. I assumed they were doing the right thing. I didn't care what was happening on the border. I assumed they were doing the right thing. I didn't care how the financial markets, by and large, were being manipulated. I assumed they were doing the right thing. My concern was that I get taxed as little as possible. Thankfully, there were people who engaged me on that and actually kind of forced me and challenged me to think about the precepts behind what I actually believe, which is what over time brought me to libertarianism. But the reality is there are people here in this movement and in this party whose primary and in some cases only concern is how their bottom line is affected. And that's not even necessarily a political thing as much as a personal thing. But, obviously we need to be putting forward people. And this is another thing I like about Vermin. Putting people forward whose primary concern is helping others, whether it's through directly helping others or through harm reduction by, using electoral politics as a mean for harm reduction to try to change the conversation at the cultural and electoral level. Whether it's trying to advocate for, mutual aid and charity solutions to try to help people now, whatever it is, their primary concern needs to be helping others. And some of us have been kind of jaded about that idea. Because when I'll say that, people will go, well, the Democrats or the Republicans, they say they want to help others, but they don't. They just want to tax us and take from us and regulate us. Okay, that's true. But that doesn't mean that we ourselves shouldn't still want to help others. It means that if anything, it is incumbent upon us to counter message what they're saying and demonstrate that they don't actually want to help others and that we do. And the best way for us to do that is to help others and to advocate for the helping of others. So I really believe that the most important thing, and I hope I'm answering your question, I really believe that the most important thing in all of our messaging, yes, it is imperative that we be across the board libertarians, that we support the platform, that we support the foundational principles of libertarianism. But it's also important that we demonstrate, or at least that our candidates, if no one else, that our candidates demonstrate that all of this is ultimately a means to an end of people being in a better situation than they currently are.
Mm-hmm. And not just the rich.
Right. All of us. Yes, correct.
Yeah, that's a a big, and there's a number of things that when it comes to selling it to the outside world that libertarians have lacked greatly, or just didn't even care about people really. For another example from your competition, Jacob Hornberger, on his campaign website, right on his website, he gives his his points for how he's going to get rid of Social Security, and his whole solution for what do you do with the people that are relying on Social Security for their entire well-being, which is a lot of elderly people,
right? Is
they'll figure it out. Like that's it. That's the entire plan. They'll figure it out.
The invisible hand.
Yeah. What? Like you're literally talking about pulling out the rug out from under people, and with nothing there in place, no plan for how to how to transition, no transition plan, no opt-out plan, no mutual aid society to come in and take care of the people. No, none of that. It's just, well, people didn't used to have it. so they don't need it now. But the thing is, there's a reason why that came into this. This is something that I take issue with a lot. Is that there's a reason for a lot of the programs the government has. There was a need for it.
Right.
A lot of the social programs, there's a need for those. It wasn't that they just came up with the idea out of thin air. It was that
it came out of a demand that was being met. It was being met poorly, and in some cases made it worse. But it came from a often popular discontent with how things were going.
Mm-hmm. Before Social Security, when you were old, you didn't have any money. Right. You had to rely in many cases on your family, and your family doesn't have any money. So you have a big problem with people. People do need money to survive. People need some sort of retirement. We can't really expect everyone to just work until the day they drop.
Right. Or be so good with their finances that they are independently, financially independent upon, when they're ready to retire or whatever else. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, there needs to be something there to take care of people. And, when your entire plan is they'll figure it out, that's not really a plan. That's not even like a suggestion of here's some ways it could work. Like at least give us some here's how it could work thing.
Right.
Like it's really poor messaging that, like I said, will only land in a room full of libertarians. Libertarians are great at having things that will only land in a room full of libertarians, unless there's me in the room and I'm like, what the fuck are you guys talking about? But this stuff lands with everyone else.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So, and this speaks to a debate on, it speaks to a few things, messaging and a debate that we have on, so-called no particular order and things like that. My thing is this. If I were to, and as Vermin likes to say, this is quite a supposition that we're doing right now, but if we were to actually get elected, and not even just me, if libertarians were to actually get elected, or even before we get elected, be able to move the needle enough where we can start affecting things at the policy level, which we really have not, at least not at the state and federal level. There may be some, referendum victories on specific issues and things like that, but on a national level, on a cultural level, we really have not done a lot, been able to move the needle just because of our small size and level of effect that comes with that small size. If we are able to do so, and we actually start seeing, government changing, if that's even possible, seeing government changing as a result of our advocacy, then I would say that the most important things are to end the harm, right? So ending wars, ending the zoning and the occupational licensing, ending the regressive nature of so many taxes. And by the way, I'm a believer that ultimately all taxes are inherently regressive. Wherever you tax, it ends up being paid at the end of the day by the consumer, which is why, centrally planned solutions ultimately typically amount to taking from those largely with the least and giving to those largely with the most. There are certainly some that are more that than others, but the reality is if we are to ever have anything resembling a post-state or even lesser state society, it has to recognize that the vast majority of people are not going to be okay with their well-being being, greatly harmed in order for us to meet some kind of philosophical satisfaction of our beliefs of the nature of man versus the state or whatever else. They're not going to say, well, okay, it's okay that my healthcare became, it's a bit harder for me to get healthcare, and I'm now having to pay out of pocket, and I can't afford it, and I can't find work, and I don't have a retirement anymore, or my grandparents or parents don't have a retirement anymore, and my rent has gone through the roof, and all of these different things. But at least we have finally put the state in its place. They don't care about that. They care about their well-being, and we can call that selfish if we want. But the reality is, they're worried about their survival. They're worried about their well-being and of those they care about. And it is incumbent upon us to, not just from a messaging standpoint, but from an actual caring standpoint, to have, like you said, have ideas of how this is going to work and demonstrate how it's going to work, and also be putting forward the harm reduction long before. I mean, listen, you're a left libertarian, and so you agree with me that ultimately an end goal is to get rid of what you would call the capitalist welfare state, which includes things like Social Security and food stamps and housing vouchers and things of that nature long term, where it's not needed anymore because we've restructured society in such a way that people aren't having to beg to the state or corporations or anyone else for their well-being, right? So that is our goal. But to say, okay, great, let's start with Medicare first, or let's start with Social Security first, instead of let's stop murdering people around the world first, or let's let all of these people out of prisons for victimless so-called crimes first, or let's, stop putting felony records on people for things and where they can never, get ahead in life unless they can afford to pay some attorney to get it expunged from their record first. Let's do those things first. Let's get rid of the zoning and the occupational licensing that removes so many of the bottom rungs from the economic ladder, so that only those with the most impressive vertical leap are able to actually, get up from generational poverty. Let's get rid of those things first. And then eventually we aren't going to need these types of things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all of that. As opposed to, we like to say that, government, welfare, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, housing vouchers, food stamps, whatever, that basically that is, government coming in and beating someone up and taking their wallet and using a little bit of the money that they stole to buy them a crutch and then saying, hey, look, if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't even have a crutch. And that's true. But then imagine if we show up and go, oh, you poor thing, look what the government did to you. We'll fix this. And we take their crutch and walk away. Like, that didn't help them. They're not going to like us more. They're not going to say, oh, wow, you know what? Come to think of it, government put me in this position in the first place. They're going to hate us for taking their crutch. So it's incumbent upon us to work with that, if we're using that analogy or that metaphor, to work with that person and get them back to whole as much as possible and stop the harm against them, so that eventually they put the crutch down because they don't need it anymore. So that to me would be much more important than the idea of ending some program right now that so many people rely on because of the state. I think it's much more important to end the state's harm that's putting them in that position in the first place.
Right, and the big thing that a lot of gets missed here, a lot gets in what's beating them up and putting them in the situation where they need the crutch to begin with.
Right.
It's not just taxation. It's not just a big part of it is, the workplace conditions, the conditions that we, how our labor is sold in our society right now, where we don't have any sort of option but to, sell our labor to a capitalist in order to, feed our bellies. There's no other option, than to start off that way. There's no access to capital. For example, worker co-ops, right? Now, every time that they're able to scratch their way into existing, they outcompete capitalist enterprises, which is why capitalists have lobbied for laws to prevent, for example, credit unions from being able to loan capital to worker co-ops so the worker co-ops don't have that access to capital. Stuff like that. And banks just won't do it, of course.
Right. Or I've seen in cases where, and I'm not as well versed in this, but I read something about how credit unions originally were designed for what you're talking about. And over time, the state introduced increasing regulations that have effectively rendered, credit unions to essentially be just banks with another name. They're required to meet the same stress tests and take the same kinds of money and bailouts and so forth. And again, I'm not extremely well versed in this, but for lack of of more research, they essentially have rendered them to be banks, co-ops in name only, or unions in name only, and they're essentially just banks under another name. And so you're kind of forcing people into this type of financial structure.
Well, it's not necessarily just that. It's that they're forbidden from doing certain things that would be within line of what the idea behind a credit union is, like a worker co-op.
Right.
They're forbidden from loaning money for commercial purposes like that. And that's not good. That puts a strain on there, and all the regulations that are tying credit unions' hands behind their backs needs to be, removed, obviously. because that those regulations that do stuff like that prevent access to capital to worker co-op startups, that prevents access to capital. Say for example, you have a business that's going to sell their business. Why shouldn't the workers be able to buy the business instead and turn it into a worker co-op? These are certain things that I think we need to start talking about. Because that's where a lot of the problem comes, is that you have a very small group of wealthy individuals that control the because most of our lives is not really living with government. You know what I'm saying? Like, we don't spend 8 hours a day in a government building.
Right.
We don't deal with government bureaucrats on a daily basis. Where we do spend our lives is in 8 hours a day, sometimes more, in a capitalist enterprise, which is structured exactly like the state. It's all hierarchy, very few rich people making all the decisions. If you don't like it, you can fuck off. If you don't like it, you can leave. The same argument that people give us about if you don't like the United States government, you can leave. If you don't like
America, you can get out.
If you don't like America, you can get out. And then where are you going to go? You go to work for another capitalist enterprise? No. There's no real choice. Just like if you don't like American taxes, you can go pay taxes to Canada. What changed here? The fundamental relationship never changed. There's no real option there. And there because of the regulations preventing worker co-ops from forming and having that access to capital to be able to get going, because people need access to capital to start a business. You need to have that. If you don't have that, you're fucked, and banks won't loan it to you. Credit unions are forbidden to give it to you. Basically, the point is, what I'm trying to make here is that we need to really focus and do something about that, and have a messaging about that listen, this is something that is being prevented that would really eliminate the need for the crutch. You don't even need to you don't need to have like all businesses be worker co-ops, but get rid of the regulations that prevent it from happening, that hinder the startup of co-ops.
Yep,
maybe even go as radical. And now this is going to probably not land very well in a libertarian audience, but maybe grant workers, a first right of refusal if a business wants to ship their company overseas or sell it to someone else, or let the business close. Why not grant?
I think at the end of the day, if you got rid of those regulations, you would effectively be giving them the first right of refusal, because in any even self-interested business, if there's going to be something, a domestic solution that's going to be largely the same as in terms of their bottom line of the workers being able to say, how about we just buy it from you instead? Even if there wasn't a mandate in place, more than likely why wouldn't they go for that? That's no skin off their back. But like you said, there are structural limitations in place and barriers and regulations in place that are preventing that from even happening. I know I've read a lot about microloans as well that are largely because of the structure of financial regulations in place in the U.S. are, if they're not outright illegal, the ability for them to really operate is essentially impossible here. There are so many situations that could be in place that would allow more people to, like I said, when you're removing the bottom rungs from the ladder and then telling everyone who is, not able to jump up to that first rung that they can get to, that they're a bunch of moochers and freeloaders, then, you're creating, we talk about class warfare. That's class warfare. And libertarians, even if you put aside the fact that I'm a right libertarian. Full disclosure, I'm a right libertarian. But even if you put aside the reality of the history of libertarianism, is that it came about from the far left, and that there still are in the majority of countries around the world, the majority of people who are libertarian or adjacent to libertarianism are of the far left. Even if you put all of that aside, just the reality of what we believe should lend itself to us supporting these types of solutions. For every time that I see someone promoting the kind of stuff you're talking about, I see 5 or 10 people explaining the inherent goodness behind Jeff Bezos. Now, listen, Jeff Bezos came up with a terrific idea, and he did it and they'll always focus on how he started, which is great. He started in a small office building and was able to create this idea. You had this idea to create, selling things online in an efficient way, and he's completely changed the market and made access to things so much easier. That's all true, and that's all great. He reached a point once he became a billionaire and wanted to remain a billionaire without continuing to innovate at that level, where now he has access to politicians. He can now, be a lobbyist. He can now sue the government when he didn't get a $20 billion cloud computing contract with the Pentagon. Mm-hmm. He can now control parts of the media with the Washington Post. And I'm not demonizing Jeff Bezos individually, or the heirs to the Walton fortune or any other individual group. But if you look at how these patterns are, these are businesses that became big, and in order to preserve their power and entrench their level of wealth and control within the market, they are harming other people. That is the zero sum part of this. Isn't that they, became wealthy through innovation of the market. It's that they then turned around and tried to close the door behind them. And in that regards, that part of the economics is zero sum. And there's no reason that libertarians should not be pushing for, we talk about decentralizing. Let's decentralize everything. I'm not saying, point a gun at people and force, business. Listen, I was a business owner. I'm not saying, force business owners to give away or sell their businesses to their workers. I'm not saying to ban profit or anything like that. What I'm saying is, like you said, remove all of the regulatory hurdles and burdens that are not allowing a market to be free and are not allowing people to voluntarily choose the kind of organizations and structures they want to be under. Because I guarantee you, if you give people that option, if you allow people to choose the kind of structures they want, they're going to look a lot more egalitarian than what we have now. They may not be, perfect socialism or perfect decentralized free market capitalism. Will probably be something in between that. And it'll probably look different from area to area or from person to person. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, it's going to look a lot more equitable and fair and horizontal than it does now.
Yep. Yeah, especially when it comes to, like you said, but here's the thing with Jeff Bezos, that a lot of people that say, oh, he's the greatest guy, he didn't write every single line of that code.
No, of course not.
No, he didn't build those factories by himself. He didn't build, he didn't build the shit that he's selling. He didn't, he personally didn't do like any of that. He personally didn't do nothing. It was all the people he hired that did all the stuff that made him so successful and wealthy. Do you think he comes up with every single idea that Amazon does, or do you think he hires a team of people that do that, and then he keeps a giant portion of the value of the idea that they created? He buys up intellectual property. He buys these ideas. Sure. Having an online bookstore grow to be the giant distribution mechanism that it is today is fascinating. And Amazon would be able to do everything that it did and grow to be the giant success that it was, and be the amazing thing that gets me, things in 2 days. In some days, one day, boom, get a thing, it's on my doorstep in one day. It could do all that as a worker co-op.
It very possibly could, and we have no way of knowing because there are restrictions in place that don't allow that to happen. Now, I will say this, and this is probably where you and I disagree, because I am a right libertarian. I also am a former business owner. And just to give you a little background on what that looked like. I, in my teens, decided that web design was probably, there was a good future in that. It was a time when most businesses had no idea. This was 98. So people knew what the internet was, but most people didn't really know what it was. And most people who own businesses had no clue what it could do for their business. And so I essentially, for the first year or two, went around and basically offered my services for free. Now, I was in a position to do so because I was a teenager who lived with his parents. So I was in a situation where I could literally work for free for about a year or so. And but I went around and said, this is what a website is, and hey, you want it for free? And most of my clients, original clients, said, I have no idea what this is. I have no reason to think this will help me. But if you want to do it for free, sure, absolutely. And so I would make it. And that allowed me to build up enough of a portfolio that I eventually was able to charge. And then in the last few years before I decided to to sell off my company. And after I was diagnosed with MS, that I needed to have less stress in my life and focus on, on getting better and on what actually gave me, what my real passion was, which was, spreading a message of liberty to a public that is often either hostile to it or scared of it. But during those last few years of my business, I was largely selling packages to people and then outsourcing the work to people who would bid on the work. So I didn't have like full-time employees, but I was basically doing like gig labor and packaging it to clients. You and others might argue that I stole people's labor. And the thing is, in a more decentralized society, my services may not have been needed. I may have been doing, the people who did work for me were thrilled to do it. But if they had another option to be able to do more of a worker-owned thing, maybe our structure would have been different. Maybe our structure would have been that I just essentially got what my percentage was as the person selling it, and other people got their percentage for doing their work, and we shared the risks. So if there was a need to make a capital purchase, we all shared in that risk. For us to not be able to, for that option not to exist, we really don't know. I don't consider what I did exploitative because the people that were doing it were happy to do it. I typically paid above market value, and I wasn't walking away with the lion's share of it. And that's true with a lot of small businesses. But the reality is, we don't know how much different that would be if those regulatory structures were not in place. Mm-hmm. and people were able to come up with these different types of business and firm structures to be able to do it. We really don't know. I think where you and I and I don't know if this is a disagreement in principle or in term. So where you might believe that profit is theft or that rent is theft, I think that it is. I think it depends more on the level of I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I think you can argue that because the state is in place and because there is the ability of, probably not me, I was never at that level, but of businesses and rent-seeking lobbyists to basically come in and create scarcity of the ability to own a business or to own property, that additional surplus of what people are having to pay for rent, or that additional surplus of what they're not making in exchange for their labor, could be argued to be theft. It's a little bit more nuanced of a discussion than, for example, an across-the-board socialist who would say that any structure in which I am getting anything more than exactly what my immediate labor paid for, if there's even a way to measure such a thing, is theft. But at the very least, I would say that we need to be working towards a decentralized society across the board, and that decentralized society, it's hard for us to even recognize what that would look like because we're so married to these, authoritarian structures that we have.
All right, so let me ask you this. Let's dive into that a little bit. Okay. Why when a libertarian would say taxation is theft, right?
Right.
What is it that makes it theft?
Oh, well, the fact that it's coercive in nature. You don't have an option not to do it, and I know what your next question is. Too.
Well, hold on. You do have an option not to do it by not doing a taxable activity.
Right, you could, which is where the counter economics comes in. Yeah.
Right. So there is an option to not pay taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But it's still theft. There's still coercion there, right? Because there's a coercive system put in place where if you want to actually make any sort of living,
right,
you got to pay taxes. And the livings you can make in a black market system, you'll go to jail.
You potentially could go to jail, right. or be harmed because you're now operating in a black market with a higher percentage of unscrupulous characters who may want to harm you in order to have control of that market, because black markets often are dangerous. I mean, we see that with the war on drugs. So, a drug that could otherwise just be sold in the store, like beer or anything else, because it is illegal or heavily regulated, you now have these, dangerous, paramilitary cartels running them at times. And, even getting involved in it, you could get, killed in your sleep. So, I mean, there's many levels of risk involved in counter economics and in black marketeering. So, yeah, absolutely.
Right. But that's the same society or the same coercive society that's there with rent and with wage labor. There's no difference between it at all. There's zero.
So I would say, again, within the structure of what we have now, that can be argued. But for example, if we had
within a structure that is a stateless society, and you could have of course there could be some sort of community protection, whatever, thing that charges something that's pretty much the same thing as taxation, and it would be completely voluntary because the only people that are paying to it actually want to, and there's other options for them to not do that.
Or competing options.
Options, so, you could have a taxation and it'd be user fees or whatever. And it would be the same, but the same thing's true with rent. Sure. There could be in a stateless society something that's similar to rent. But there would be other options. There's not only, there's not a limiting of options. There's not a limiting of access to capital to start a business. Because it's the same thing. There's literally no difference between what makes, taxation theft and what makes rent or profit theft.
And so here's why I think there's a little bit of nuance. If you are, for example, applying that across the board, you could argue that a restaurant selling food is theft for the same reasons, that because of those structural situations that are in place, that it is creating a level of scarcity, and that, again, the same thing that you would say with wage labor or with rent or with any of these things.
Yes.
You could argue, and I'm not saying
apartments
that you
are genocide.
What's that?
Apartments are genocide. No.
And what do you mean by that?
I was just trying to one up the whole rent is theft thing.
Okay. go to, yeah. So if rent is theft, then multiple rents are genocide. Yeah. I mean, you could do that. You can say, and I mean, I'm not even saying that you shouldn't say that, or that's not logically congruent with what we're saying. I think that, and again, this goes back to the marketing end of it, and I do, like I said, think that there's some nuance there, that you could argue that any kind of interactions that we're having that are commercial in nature, buying food, rent, wage labor, any of these things, or even interpersonal relationships. How many sexual relationships are based on at least a level of financial need, where someone has chosen one partner over another because of how well they treat them financially? And in a decentralized society, would that even matter? I mean, some of that is how much that person values you or whatever. But I mean, there are people who right now are in, legit, I'm in it for the cash relationships. Mm-hmm. We could argue that is a form of theft or rape.
It is.
And again,
totally
those are legitimate conversations to have. To me, it all ends up going back to the reality of the coercive, centralized, centrally planned, cynical structure that we live under. And I'm increasingly less. So like I said, I'm a right libertarian. I tend to be more of a right libertarian. I am increasingly not interested in defending the term capitalism and saying, oh, it's not capitalism, it's corporatism. First of all, it's a term that was coined by Marx. Marx decided what it meant when he said it, and it's not what the vast majority of ANCAPs are advocating for when we advocate for what we want.
Well, technically, no.
Or right-leaning anarchists are pushing for. So why? Even von Mises wrote about how maybe we should just abandon that term. So again, getting into labels about what is or isn't theft, what is or isn't, coercion or rape or whatever else. I think it's important to talk about the coercive nature of these things. I think it's also important to take it back to its root source, which is the coercive nature of a collective monopoly on violence that's able to centrally plan everything, and all of the other coercive, centrally planned, exploitative structures that come up into place in reaction to that are able to oppress the vast majority of people to the benefit of a small minority of people.
Well, I want to just correct you for a second. It wasn't Marx that coined capitalism. It was Thomas Hodgkin.
Oh, okay.
Who was, coined it for the same thing, though. It was a pejorative. Capitalist was coined as a pejorative for those who benefited from the mercantilist system. It is coined to be synonymous with the mercantilist system.
Okay, well, I stand corrected.
Yeah.
Was it Marx that made that popularized the term?
Yes.
Or?
Yeah. Marx picked it up from Marx picked it up and popularized it. But it wasn't coined by Marx.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, I stand corrected. So he popularized or brought it into the public consciousness,
Yes.
but it was actually the other who did it. Okay,
Yes,
cool.
Not really not really changing anything with your argument, because you're still correct.
No,
it was
glad
coined.
To know. I keep saying that. So
it was coined by socialists.
Not to say that anymore.
It was coined by socialists to about the mercantilist system.
Right, about a mercantilist system, right?
Which is, there's nothing that's different. That's what capitalism was. It never was like an ideology of free markets, and it was always about profit. It was always about what gains and increases capital. That's why. That's another funny thing about it, is that the capitalist was a person. It wasn't like someone who subscribed to an idea.
It wasn't an ideology.
It wasn't an ideology.
It was a person who had access and ownership of capital. Right.
So when people who are working class say I'm a capitalist, it's kind of like a facepalm moment, because what means of production do you own, dude? Right. Which is hilarious, but if they want to call them, I would free marketeer would be something that would be better. A free enterprise. Say I support free enterprise instead of I support capitalism. You'd have a lot more, or a lot less objection from left libertarians if right libertarians didn't go around yelling that they're capitalists. If they said, well, I support, a market-based economy.
And not just left libertarians, the general public. Mm-hmm. If you go out into the general public right now, especially younger people, and talk about free market, even the term free market has been bad. Now that's at least an example of the term being bastardized. Whereas with capitalism, we're trying to co-opt a term that was, like you said, created as a pejorative to describe something that we don't actually support. But at least with the example of free market, it's a bastardized term. But if you go out to people and say, I'm a laissez-faire free market capitalist, a lot of people are going to have a really bad image of who you are and what you believe, especially if you tend to knee-jerk defend Walmart and Jeff Bezos. You're really kind of helping double down on that, that stereotype they might have of you. And I think that is, when I talk about things, I do tend to use the term free market alone, but I also tend to I tend to talk to people about voluntary societies and voluntary systems of interaction over coercive ones, and setting people free. Because ultimately, when we talk about the market isn't this self, this monolithic being that interacts on its own, separate from humanity. The market is just people interacting with each other in one way or another. So why not just talk about people?
Right.
Like I get the useful purpose of talking about the market, but when we're messaging to people who don't talk about this stuff and are way more concerned about making ends meet, why not talk to them about people, about them? Why not talk about them instead of using labels for somewhat obscure terms that they may not fully understand what we're even talking about.
Right. And say, for example, you go to, a low-income apartment complex and you start yelling taxation is theft, it's not going to land. But you tell them rent is theft, that's going to land. You can explain to them, why the system put in place, what's going on, why rent is the way it is, why you're paying so much to live in a apartment complex managed by a slumlord who hasn't fixed the dishwasher whatever. Your shit's leaking, your neighbor's sink is flooding your and they're not fixing it. You've called the landlord 50,000 times and they hang up on you and they're not going to fix it, but you still have to pay it. Otherwise, the government comes with guns and puts you out on the street, and then you have no place to live. No,
it
gets
like
worse than that.
Speaking to your audience,
I want to tell you a story of something that happened in my home state in Detroit. A lot of people, I think, a lot of libertarians need to go to Detroit. This is something that highlights, our modern capitalist system. Nothing highlights it better than Detroit, because Detroit is entirely the way it was. entirely the way it is because of a couple giant monolithic corporations that decided it would be more profitable for them to pull out of those cities and go elsewhere. And it collapsed the entire society. And you drive through it. I remember during the Michigan convention, not this past one that was virtual, one before that, when Caleb Dyer from New Hampshire, former New Hampshire state representative, he was coming to speak for the Libertarian Party of Michigan convention, and I had picked him up from the airport, and I took him through, I was just driving through Detroit, and I was driving through a very nice area of Detroit. Now, a very nice area of Detroit is different than a very nice area of anywhere else. And right. Caleb starts freaking out. He thinks we're in the middle of a war zone. He'd never seen anything like it in his life.
Right.
And I'm like, Caleb, this is the nice area. And it blew his mind because he had never seen a place that would be considered a nice area with, roofs with holes in it. It looks like there was bombs dropped on the city. But it was a nice area. That's where people still live.
Right.
That's where it's nice. And he had never seen anything like it in his life, coming from, New Hampshire.
Right.
And that was all because of a couple of corporations decided it would be more profitable to produce the cars elsewhere. And
to move the base of production to the south and to Mexico and to China. And
and it completely destroyed the economy of the city. The social cost of that is ridiculous. The cost that has put on society just so they could make a few dollars is ridiculous. And that would be a problem that wouldn't happen if, there was that first right of refusal in there and the workers could say, well, you know what, this is our factory now. But that's going back to that. But basically what happened in Detroit during like the 2008 financial collapse, and this happened a lot, is that the families, a lot of families, they own their homes. They were paid off, generations ago. It was their grandmother's house. That's now their house. They'd been living in it for years. And during the 2008 financial collapse, it got even worse there, right?
Right.
And now there's absolutely no jobs. Nothing at all. Even after the job market was already terrible, there was hardly anything there. But then it got even worse. Michigan was hit really hard during the recession. And, a lot of those homes were seized by the government because of back taxes. Because now your house, they're wanting you to pay taxes on a house you got no job. The taxes are more than the house is worth. They're trying to have you pay. You couldn't sell the house for the cost of the taxes.
Right, and those taxes are essentially a form of you could call it a form of rent, where you basically you don't really own your property, you're renting it from the government. You may be paying less than what a rent would be if someone else owned it, owned it as a middleman. But at the end of the day, if you don't pay that, you end up losing it.
Yep, rent is taxation.
Yeah,
and so then the government comes in and seizes all the homes, and what do they do with the homes? They sell them to investors, the only people that had any money,
right.
The 1%, the rich, the powerful, the elite. they had all the money in the world. They bought all the houses. And guess what they did with them? They rented them back to the people who owned the house free and clear for decades. Now you got to rent the home that your grandmother paid off. Now you got to rent it from me.
Yep.
And if you don't rent it from me, the government's going to come with their guns and they're going to kick you out. And if you resist, they're going to shoot you. Pay your rent. And, that kind of thing happens all the time. That's not really like an isolated incident. That type of situation happens.
That's part and parcel of the experience. And obviously in a place like in a place like Detroit that was so heavily affected both positively and negatively when it came to it by a handful of companies, they're going to experience it in a much more acute way, because when all of those companies, in a far less diverse job market when those handful of companies that are providing most of the jobs or have control of most of the labor just leave, then everyone's screwed. Now, my understanding is that the similar situation in Flint, where when the business, when the manufacturing companies there left, that pretty much left everyone destitute, and they didn't really have much to try to start their own, and they couldn't really start a small business mesh network there because, like you were talking about, all the structural restrictions that are in place of people being able to start their own very small businesses. And again, this is a great opportunity for libertarians to talk about these things. What I will say, and I come from the right, I am a right libertarian. I came here originally as a frustrated Republican, and over time have become what I am now. So I understand the aversion that some have from the right when we start talking about the relationship between the state and between essentially capitalists, or what you would call capitalists, between corporations. We might be comfortable talking about it on a macro level or on a high level where, if we're talking about an Amazon or about a Walmart, it gets a lot more murky when we're talking about it with like real estate investors and people like that, because our experience has been that when we hear people talking about these things and start talking about the bad actions, even if they're state manipulated actions by private actors, that it usually then comes with some kind of prescription of a government intervention to stop it. And so I can tell you my initial reaction when I hear things like this is, if I think that the person is trying to propose some greater state action, is to explain how the state got us there. But at the end of the day, it's the same thing. If we are talking about bad actions that are happening as a result of coerced, forced interactions between people, and in this case, like you said, how when the businesses who owned everything left, and the workers weren't in a position to be able to try to either buy it or have already had ownership in it so that they had a stake in that decision, they're now left behind high and dry, still have to pay the taxes to the government, then can't pay those taxes, so other people who can afford it come in and buy their own properties from them and now rent it back to them. And then there's potentially a situation where they can't afford that rent, so now they're having to huddle together into more people living into one property, or they're homeless and are now living as wards of the state. If we don't address these situations, people aren't all going to suddenly become hyper industrious and be able to. Not every single person can beat the odds, or they wouldn't be the odds. And the more coercive and the more vertical and the more limitations and barriers you put in place, the harder and harder and harder it becomes for people who aren't already at a position of financial independence to be able to do those things. And what a great opportunity for us as libertarians to talk about this, to put away our labels and to put away our presumptions about people's intentions and actually listen to what they have to say. The average Bernie voter doesn't want to hold a gun to your head to pay for their health care. The average Bernie voter is worried about their health care. They want to know that their healthcare is being taken care of in some way or another. They want to make sure that all their time they've spent in higher education will actually be rewarded at some point, that they'll be able to get a good job. These are their concerns. They have legitimate, real life concerns just like the rest of us. And if we listen to what their concerns are, and with our understanding, our greater, macro understanding of the societal structures that are in place that are causing this, we're the perfect messengers for this. We just have to actually do it. And if it takes, and it may take certain people speaking to other certain people, you may be in a better position to speak to, tenants that are, about to lose everything than I am. I may be in a better position to speak to, business owners that are facing laying off all of their employees, small business owners that have, 4 or 5 employees that are facing having to, lay off all of their employees, or have everyone, including themselves, take a pay cut because of some new government regulation or tax or some kind of change in government policy that makes it impossible for them to do business, then you might. But at the end of the day, we're all speaking to people who have legitimate, serious concerns, and we have a potential to get people behind these decentralized, voluntary, non-coercive, non-centrally planned, non-monopolized ideas. And I also am a believer that if we were to, get rid of the state, even if we could snap our fingers and get rid of it right now, or more likely incrementally get rid of it over time and change people's minds, I'm not presumptuous enough to believe that all 7.5 billion people, or however many billion people are on the planet at that point, are all going to voluntarily structure their societies to look exactly the same. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that it takes quite a bit of hubris for us to say, oh yeah, we're all going to be living in Ancapistan or Comistan or whatever, Mutual
Compton.
Compton or Mutual Berg or whatever. Like, we can't pretend to know what it's going to look like. What's important is to remove the coercion and to allow the market, the invisible hand, or we could be a little bit, nicer and just say allow people interacting voluntarily with other people to determine how they want it to look.
Mm-hmm. That's the truth. And, that's good to hear. We really do need to have a broad messaging going across, because the idea of getting rid of, state power, corporate power, putting giving the power back to the people.
Yeah, power to the people. Yeah.
That is a message that resonates with everyone and that everyone can get behind, except for, of course, those who benefit from the state. Of course, anyone who benefits from state will go, no. And
benefit from the state.
And I don't mean benefit from the state. Yeah, exactly. Benefit from the state doesn't mean those who...
Benefit from the state doesn't mean food stamps.
Right, no.
Benefit from the state means like they're extremely because that's another thing. People, when they hear about someone benefiting from the state, they immediately start thinking of someone who survives because the state has taken everything else from them and is giving them crumbs. That's not what benefit. They're not. Even someone who's committing welfare fraud in multiple counts of welfare fraud couldn't possibly hope
I'm going to advocate
benefit
that
from the state nearly as much as some of these people that are legally doing it and making billions from it.
Welfare fraud is good. Libertarians should be committing welfare fraud. It's good. This is entertainment purposes only, not actual advice.
But as I say on my show often, I would never encourage you to commit a crime now or at any other point, especially not on the internet where everyone can see it.
But definitely the people who are benefiting from the state are the people who are at the top. Right. It's the people who, it's the Jeff Bezoses. Jeff Bezos is benefiting from the state. Where does he get all that land to build those giant warehouses on? Oh, eminent domain, literally stealing people's homes and demolishing them. Where does Walmart get all its property? Oh, eminent domain. This kind of stuff happens all the time. Even where the roads are built is dictated by,
decided by the companies. Exactly.
Decided by the companies. Yep. Everything. There was actually a study that was done on this. Oh, shoot. I wish I could remember. Ah, man. I'm having a blank. But there was a study done. I can't remember what was it, Stanford? I don't even... Well,
the beauty is you can edit this later for you to say that you knew exactly where it was from.
Well, no, I don't edit content at all. So people know when I fuck up a joke. All the people who listen to my show know when I fuck up a joke or forget something. But yeah, there was a study that was done that was that showed that the average person has literally zero political power at all. Zero. Oh, yeah. The only people that have any sort of say in the policy of government are the extremely wealthy. We don't have any say at all. The vote with your dollars thing that, so many, it pisses me off so much whenever libertarians want to do that shit. The vote with your dollar, and then one person comes in and wins it because they dropped, 10 grand or whatever. But that's actually accurate to how society works.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a cynical reality of what we are experiencing. Yeah.
What drives me crazy about it is when you have these assholes that be like, "Oh, this is good actually." That drives me crazy. No, that's not good. It's not good when one person can come in and drop all the money in the fucking world and get exactly what they want and leave everybody else high and dry and it gets nothing.
in a party that is explicitly, at least ostensibly, against such things. Like that's a really bad. Besides being a bad look, it's also it really, again, my agorist is coming out about whether or not it's even possible for us to try to create the society through an electoral party if we can't even do it when we have no power. What happens when we have power? And that's a whole other discussion to have about trying to get 5% so we can get some of that federal money for our elections. I mean, we could really go into a whole thing about whether or not it's even, if we're not able to, I mean, you talk about like a prefigurative type of thing. If we're not able to demonstrate within our own party that we can create this sort of decentralized voluntary structure that isn't about, rewarding those with the most at the expense of those with the least, how on earth could we prove to anyone outside of the party that that's what we want to do? And how on earth could we prove to ourselves that that's what we plan to do if we actually get any real power?
Well, what if I told you that a bunch of your right libertarian comrades actually like it like that?
And that's the thing. I mean, there are. I mean, I will say this, and it's left or right, because I mean, we can talk about tankies, we can talk about alt-light people or just people that are here, like I'd said earlier on, people that are literally just here for whatever it is for their immediate bottom line, as opposed to trying to create a less coercive and more voluntary and less violent and more peaceful and more prosperous for everyone type of society. More important to me than left or right. Because once you remove the coercion, left and right are essentially questions of preference and really personal guessing as to what it's even going to look like minus the coercion. Really, yeah. I mean, and I say that as someone who has very strong beliefs on why I am more on the right side of the spectrum. But more important to me is how anti-authoritarian someone is. If someone comes in and goes, listen, I am a libertarian socialist, and I believe that in a voluntary society, there won't be any kind of boss worker situations, because everyone is going to naturally move into more communally owned communal structures. I go, yeah, that's great. You may or may not be correct. I may or may not be correct. It may be that in some places and with some people, your version is what it's going to look like. In some places and with some people, my version is more what it's going to look like, or there's going to be kind of a hodgepodge of people. What matters the most is that A, we don't really know, and B, if we remove the coercion, wherever it goes is where people wanted it to go. And that's more important than, me being proven right or you being proven right or anything else, because no one's going to get proven right as long as the state and its rent-seeking cronies that it benefits continue to exponentially grow in power and wealth at the expense of everyone else. That none of that matters. It's all just us arguing for no real good reason.
Mm-hmm. Well, I tend to see, now this is kind of, I guess, argumentative. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't.
That's fine.
But
that's fine.
But here, what I've noticed, the main difference between right and left libertarians when it comes to arguing for what the society would look like and how the businesses would be structured in a stateless society, right, absent all the coercion. I tend to see right libertarians always picture themselves almost 100% of the time. I can't say 100% of the time because maybe I missed it, but I cannot think of a single time I've ever seen this not be the case, where right libertarians always place themselves in the position of the boss.
Of the boss, right.
Of the boss. It's always, I'm the boss. In every example they ever give, every time they're talking about what a business structure would look like in a stateless society, they always place themselves as the boss. And what I always find ironic about it is almost always they're not currently a boss. But whereas in left libertarians, they don't place themselves in an idea of being a boss at all. They place themselves always as equals to all their peers. They never place themselves above anyone in any hierarchical structure ever. And when they're talking about, well, this is how it would work. And, when you bring up, for example, when you're like saying to a right libertarian, and this may not be 100% of the time, I'm going to say it may not be 100% of the time, but a lot of times when you're talking to a right libertarian, you're talking about, it's always the boss. It's always they're the boss, and all their examples, all the examples that they type up and be like, well, I have the right to employ someone. It's never It's never, I have the right to seek employment from somebody. It's always, I have the right to employ someone. Always. And I think that's a big part of the problem here is that, you know, you have there's a tendency there on the right to always want to place yourself above in a hierarchy. And that causes a lot of uneasiness with those of us that are the libertarian left, because we don't like hierarchy. That's why we're anarchists. Anarchist means we're against fucking hierarchy. And, and it's a mirror though of the hierarchy of a business is a mirror of the hierarchy of the state. Unless this is the same thing, the same thing, which is why I'm going to talk shit about tankies now. Fuck tankies. All right. So this is the same thing with tankies. When the Bolshevik Revolution happened and Lenin took power and all that, they never changed the fundamental relationship. They never changed what actually was the problem with the capitalist and feudalist society. They never changed the fundamental issue, which was the workplace structure, the structure of society. They just took the private capitalists, boom, threw them away. Now here we go. Here you have instead of a businessman, you have an agent of the state. Now they're your boss. Right. They're your boss now. It didn't really change anything. It made it just turned the corporation into the state. It didn't actually change none of the fundamental structure of it was all the same. And then, when people were like, hey, wait a minute, weren't we supposed to change something? And I'm going to butcher the name because I can't pronounce Russian shit for shit. But Kronstadt, whatever, Kronstadt. No, I can't. God damn it. All right. I'm terrible at pronouncing shit. But I'm sure people kind of know what I'm talking about. They get an idea of the word I'm trying to say, hopefully. So Trotsky goes and he slaughters a bunch of people that were like, hey, what the fuck? We wanted, worker ownership of the means of production.
Right. We wanted seizing the means of production meant for workers, not for the state.
Exactly. And so, there was never a fundamental change in that. And it's kind of because it's the same structure. The state structure is the same thing as the capitalist structure. The reason why Marxist-Leninism is not socialism is because it was just capitalism that replaced the state just put the state in the place of the corporation. It didn't actually change a single fucking thing about the system. It didn't change anything. The fundamental structure was still intact from the old system, and tankies are fucked because of it. And they like to kill anarchists who wanted to say otherwise. Say, hey, wait a minute, this shit's fucked, and the tankies would go off and kill them. But
anarchists were the first people that were among the first people that the Bolsheviks killed when they took over. Right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what may have started as an idea of wanting to actually do something good, they didn't change anything. There was nothing that was changed. And I have there's an issue there with right libertarians, because it seems almost like a lot of, and I don't mean to try and attack you here. Please, no disrespect.
I don't feel attacked.
No disrespect. But, I see that a lot of right libertarians are almost like reverse tankies.
So,
like they want to, replace the state now. Now we're just going to do the opposite, and we're going to replace the state with the corporation, and nothing fundamentally changes about it. Now, instead of living in Michigan, I live in, GM Incorporated zone or 1 or whatever the fuck, and that's what I kind of have a concern about, if there's no actual wanting to change the fundamental structure and no wanting to get rid of that hierarchy and wanting to keep a hierarchy intact, that's where I kind of have concern.
Yeah, so my experience has been a little bit different. And again, as a right libertarian, which is why I wonder if maybe you're, and I can't know this without knowing your experience, but I wonder if you are sometimes getting what's rising to the top of I guess, argumentation, either online or in person, people who are defending a system and doing it in that kind of terms as opposed to what their actual goals are. I will say this, and I say this as someone who was a business owner. I originally came into libertarianism because of a combination of my bottom line and how regulations and taxes hurt me, but also after seeing what the immigration system did, dealing with bringing my wife here, after seeing what war had done, really spending more and more time. And this is to their credit. It was right libertarians that exposed me to the horrors that were happening in war. It's not to say that left libertarians weren't doing the same. It was just I wasn't operating in those circles, so I didn't see it. But seeing what the horrors of war were causing and were making people, causing massive amounts of untold suffering and making people hate us as a result, making us less safe at our expense of our money and at their expense of their lives. So it was those things that brought me into it. I will say that I have heard a little bit more nuanced than apparently you have from right libertarians when we're talking, at least within ourselves, about these kinds of questions. Because we get a lot of people coming in new that'll say things like that. What stops the government from just being replaced by GM Incorporated, and get a lot more nuanced responses to that. I've also seen people who are talking about their relationship with their boss as opposed to when they become a boss. What I have seen a lot of is people, and there is such a thing. Mike Shipley calls it entrepreneurial identity politics, and that I felt personally attacked when he said that, because I definitely came from that. But there are a lot of people who wish to be entrepreneurs, work for themselves, and as opposed to having to work for someone else, which actually speaks to some of what what left libertarians would say, not having to have a boss.
We can all work for ourselves.
What's that?
I said we can all work for ourselves together.
Well, and that's the thing. So I think when someone talks about being an entrepreneur, not necessarily a boss that becomes the boss of some larger company or something like that, that they're essentially in different terms saying largely the same thing. I will say this: there are people who want to be able to have the option to work with others who also are okay with doing so in doing the business owner thing, where they do the startup and assume the risk in exchange for working with people who then will lend their labor or give their labor, sell their labor, whatever, and that they make a profit as a natural consequence of their having done that. And in a decentralized society, that obviously is going to look a lot different than it does now. I think that the gap between, especially as that business gets bigger, that gap between what the profit is and what the people are being compensated for their work is going to probably be a lot different than it is now. But I also so I was a B2B business. So I worked with businesses, and I saw a lot of businesses, even in this current structure that we have now, where, there's a common saying that a lot of small business owners, they'll say, when you own a small business, you're the last person to get paid. And that's usually the case for small businesses, for small firms, 10, 20 or fewer employees. That is often the case. So again, a little bit more nuanced than the, Mick Nuke Corporation or whatever that, that some people will fantasize about. But I mean, the reality is that, again, are there some people that are drawn to libertarianism because of a desire to be even more wealthy and powerful? Absolutely. Are there people that are drawn to it because of a resentment of others? Sure, absolutely. Hopefully they don't stick around for long, or they learn that libertarianism is the opposite of that, and that the natural logical progression of our beliefs is a much more egalitarian one than we have now. It doesn't necessarily mean, and I'm not a believer that there's not going to be any difference in outcome for anyone and that we're all going to have exactly the same thing. I don't think that in any natural situation is going to work that way. But I think that this completely lopsided thing where a handful of people own everything is completely artificially imposed by central planners who are, pointing guns at everyone. I also think this speaks to, I hate to say horseshoe theory confirmed, but it may have happened, where, I'm not a huge fan of the political compass because it kind of pretends that there is this, far left, far right within a anarchist structure. I think the closer you get to being an anarchist, and if you want to call it left or right or whatever, that's fine. I think the closer you get to being an anarchist, the more you are in this kind of center where you don't want anyone to have any real, coerced centralization of power, and that those other ideas of what, that may have gotten you there kind of fall to the wayside, so that the more to the forced left of that horseshoe or the forced right of that horseshoe you are, the less naturally libertarian you are in the first place.
Well, I kind of wanted to bring back to one of the kind of the original topic at hand. Mm-hmm. Now, when we're looking at 2020, Trump is obviously going to win because all he needs to do is listen to this next 30 seconds to this podcast and I'll tell him exactly how to do it and he'll be able to walk away with the election. He goes out onto the debate stage carrying a pillow. He gives it to Joe and tells him to go to sleep. Boom. Cheers. Audience goes wild. His polls shoot up 20 points. Then he runs an ad every commercial break that has Joe Biden talking about kids touching his leg hair mixed in with him sniffing kids and run that every commercial break. Boom, Trump walks away with fucking 60% of the vote. Right. That's all Trump needs to do to win. So in a world where Trump's obviously going to win, pretty much no matter what happens, obviously there's, I guess a snowball's chance in hell that Biden's able to do it. But Trump supporters are wild, man. They literally support him no matter what. It's wild. It is.
When
truly...
he said the thing about I could shoot anyone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and people would vote for me.
Yeah.
And the reaction to that was almost universally positive from his supporters. Mm-hmm. I realized, and they were saying, I would. He's right. And I thought, yeah, he is right. He has created a cult of personality, and whatever else we can say about him, which is almost universally negative, he has successfully created a cult of personality from a combination of sort of harnessing. He's done it. He harnessed people's fears. He listened to what they had to say, and then he gave them policy prescriptions. Mm-hmm. The problem is his policy prescriptions are terrible and destructive and rooted in fear and hatred, but he did it. He did the thing, and now has, tens of millions of dedicated diehards who will brave a pandemic to go out and vote for him. So no, because it's even more than what you were just saying about, opinion polls and everything else. Let's say it's 50-50 on whether people want Trump, or 45-45, whatever, that, pretty split between the electorate on whether they want Trump or Biden. Who's going to come out and vote during a pandemic? Mm-hmm. The people who think it's a hoax, the people who think it's overblown just to hurt the president. And then you go a step further. What are the areas that are going to be able to actually effectively have social distancing and still have everyone vote? The rural areas and suburban areas. Urban areas already have difficulty getting everyone to be able to vote in time when they're, huddled together in lines. You can't have them 6 feet apart. And then again, that's before you get into the fact that a lot of them aren't going to want to do it because they're scared to go outside. They've been told, stay at home, stay at home, stay at home. So everything structurally is in place for Trump to beat Biden. Unless
they get universal vote by mail, which Trump has claimed he would oppose.
He said, and he even said why he'd oppose it. He said he was against it because you would never see another Republican get elected on a national level again.
It's true.
And he was right.
He's right.
He absolutely said it.
Yeah, so he's absolutely right. The only reason why Republicans get elected is because of suppressing votes. As much as they want to claim Democrats want to, Democrat voter fraud, this, that, and the other thing, the reality of it is that suppressing votes is what gets Republicans elected almost always. Well, it's putting so few polling I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Because I knew you were prefacing this with a question, but I really am fascinated by the subject. So I'm sorry if I'm derailing.
No, it's fine.
What your question was going to be a little bit. But when you look at polls that show that, let's say there's a poll that says Biden is ahead by Trump, 47 to 45, and the people who are analyzing that data go, well, this means Trump's going to win, because if you look at it, if Trump can get within 3 points of the national national polling, that means he'll actually win it because of turnout models and the electoral college. That's not good. Like that speaks to a problem. If you like that, if you hear that and are relieved, that means you're a Republican. So if you're not a Republican, then you're not relieved by that. You are actually very upset to hear that, not because you like Biden or uniquely hate Trump over Biden, but because a system that has imposed itself on you and told you that the only mechanism you have to affect how they treat you at gunpoint is through your vote, but then tells you that there's one party that can be as much as 3 or even 4 points behind another party and still win decidedly because of a combination of voter turnout and structural things that are in place that make it harder for the other members of the other party to vote, and then also an electoral college system that's in place that gives preference over rural and suburban smaller population states over larger ones. That's troublesome. Mm-hmm. That's a troublesome thing. That's something we shouldn't be in favor of.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And so
I'm sorry to derail whatever your question was going to be.
It's fine. It's kind of on topic. So you have an entire system set up that's it's rigged for one party.
Right.
It's the one party that it's rigged for happens to have an extremely loyal fan base. That, I mean, for fuck's sake, Trump could come out and he could do anything. He could do anything. And so you got him. He's your guy. He's probably gonna win. Biden might pull it off. He might not. So I mean, what's the best? You're not gonna do anything, right? You're not gonna affect the outcome of the election. But why should Now I'm gonna say this because I'm gonna say this though. If there's vote by mail or absentee voting, because I would not want to ever kind of encourage anyone to go out and go to these goddamn elections right now. I mean, for fuck's sake, you look at some of the numbers of places that had Michigan they were doing some looking into it, and the reason why Michigan is so fucked right now is because we had our primary not that long ago, and then that kind of coincided with boom. So, I'm not going to advocate during this pandemic, if it's not solved by November, probably going to want to do absentee voting or vote by mail if they're able to get that. But one more thing before I actually ask this. One thing that's fascinating right now about this election, too, is that Donald Trump is on a lot of issues running to the left of Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, like with the $1,200 and all that. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer were trying to means test it, and Trump's like, no, just give him the $1,200. It was like that is wild. But basically what I'm trying to say is, why should people vote at all for or really more importantly, why would casting a vote for a Vermin Supreme Spike Cohen ticket, what would be the benefit of doing so? Not necessarily just for this election, but elections previous. What would that do that would benefit? What's the reason for it?
The shortest answer, and I don't really give a lot of short answers, so prepare for a longer answer, but the shortest answer is that it is essentially a no confidence vote. If there is a demonstration, and there's no harm to it because there isn't anything bad that comes as a result of your not voting for Joe Biden or Donald Trump. These are both terrible people behind terrible parties who do terrible, horrible, and disgusting things. And if there is ever to be, and I don't know that this is the case, but if there is ever to be any harm reduction or even betterment of how things are through the electoral process, it's going to come from a party and from candidates who are offering a wild divergence from what the people in power are currently doing. And in my mind, that is the Libertarian Party that is proposing that. If they put forward actual candidates who are actual libertarians, that's a whole other subject. A vote for Vermin Supreme and Spike Cohen, a vote for Vermin Supreme and Spike Cohen is a no confidence vote. It's a protest vote. It is a look at the system and saying, if we're going to be put into a joke of a system that is run by clowns who, make these ridiculous promises and then turn around and hurt you, I would much rather vote for the funniest joke and the funniest clowns who make the most ridiculous of the promises and who have absolutely no intention of harming me. I would rather vote for a joke and satire over the actual cynical, harmful jokes that are being presented by the Republicrats. That is the immediate question of why people should vote Libertarian. The question of why we should be running as libertarians like this is to bring people in on this message and then expose them to the actual message of libertarianism and to bring people into it. And especially with Vermin, again, and I know you see it, you're on Twitter just like me, and you're seeing just the sheer number of people that are showing interest, not in libertarianism, but in Vermin, an entire generation, possibly even 2 generations of voters who are looking at Vermin and are actually looking at what he is saying that he represents. It could bring an entire group of people that are going to be making policy decisions long after most of us are dead and voting decisions long after most of us are dead, exposing them to our message of voluntary and non-coercive and peaceful societies that no one else is really talking about. And so that is the purpose behind this. That's when people talk about, why are we, putting in someone with a boot on his head who's promising ponies and, what's he going to do in his first 100 days? And I get asked that stuff and I answer it because it's a legit, I am running for the office. So yeah, if I were elected, here's what I would do. But we know the structural realities of what are in front of us and the actual odds of that happening. I will say this. I think Vermin Supreme is one of the most presidential people I've ever, he is someone I would rather have in the White House than most other people that I've ever even met in my life. So I would be fine with that. But ultimately what we are running is a no confidence vote. We are running a campaign of saying, here is your chance to say fuck you to this entire system and to expose it for the joke it is, and to bring people into the reality that this many people voted for someone who is openly running on satire and who would occasionally take off the clown nose or the boot or whatever and start talking seriously about what we have to say about our prescriptions for this society to make it better. So that is what is gained from voting Libertarian. And if nothing else, you're not voting for endless war, endless theft, endless caging of innocent people, endless disproportionate harm against marginalized communities, people of color, gender and sexual minorities, low-income people. You're at least not voting for that. You're voting against that, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm. That is a good point. And thank you for coming on the show, Spike. Glad to have you on here. And all the stuff I'm supposed to say before I say that, where can people find out more about you and more about the Vermin Supreme campaign?
Sure, absolutely. So if you want to find out more about me, my website is spike2020.com. On social media, on Twitter, I am at Real Spike Cohen. On Facebook, if you're putting it in the address bar, it's facebook.com/literally Spike Cohen. Or if you're searching in the Facebook search bar, it's Spike Cohen, your next VP. If you're looking for Vermin, verminsupreme2020.com, or just look for Vermin Supreme on any social media outlet. He is everywhere on the internet. He's on TikTok. He's on everything. I think the one thing he's not on is Snapchat, but he's on everything else.
We got to get Vermin to Snapchat.
If you want to look for my shows, that's on Muddy Waters Media, muddywatersmedia.com, or you can find Muddy Waters Media on pretty much any social media outlet, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Periscope, all of those. So I hope to hear from you. And if you're a Libertarian Party member or delegate and you have any questions about my campaign and my advocacy, I'd be more than happy to hear what you have to ask me. Be sure to reach out to me on my social media, and I'll be happy to get back to you.
All right. And all the things I'm supposed to say at the end of these shows, hashtag please donate to the Patreon, all that stuff. But make sure if you're wanting to join the Libertarian Party, go to lp.org/podcast titles are spooked. Despooked. It really doesn't matter, I think, in most browsers. So go either way. You definitely don't put like a semicolon. That won't work.
Any slash is fine.
Don't put a period. That won't work. So don't go to lp.org.podcast Spook. That's not a thing. lp.org/podcast Spook. Go to there, join, pay $25, become a member. And a portion of that actually comes back to the show. And unlike most of the people who are signed up on the program, I'm going to shame all of them right now, especially the big name podcasters who are raking off of this program. I am donating everything that is made from that to libertarian candidates, such as Vermin Supreme. So make sure that, if you're going to join the party, do it that way. That way, some of that money also goes to awesome libertarian campaigns instead of through other people's links who it goes into their pockets. Whatever. And nice spooks, nerd.